I would not personally choose either of these men to be president. Joe Biden, over his political career, just absolute political mayhem. And by the way, just servile obedience to whatever is necessary to get him elected to office. What he did on abortion in 2020, and basically just switching his position overnight, one night, so that he didn't lose the primary the next day. And I'll go so far as to say, I think he sold his soul to the culture of death. And just a politically corrupt figure in and of himself. In my lifetime, he had to withdraw from one presidential campaign from not only stealing someone else's speech, but stealing it badly. And then you have Donald Trump. And I mean, it just is a moral problem. He's a complexity of moral problems, not to mention, just absolute ego. And so from a Christian perspective, I don't want either of these two men, but one of them is going to be elected president of the United States.
Dr. Albert Mohler is the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kentucky in the United States. He's the author of many books. He has a daily podcast, The Briefing, that is heard worldwide, including widely in Australia. His latest book is on the parables. Tell me the story of Jesus, the explosive power of Jesus's parables. Dr. Mohler, thank you so very much for joining us again.
It is so good to be with you once again, and greetings to Australia.
Thank you. We last spoke on the eve of the 2020 elections, and so what I'd really like to do is explore your thinking about how America has changed under President Biden's administration. What were your initial concerns about where he would take the country, and to what extent have those concerns been realized?
I would think I would have to say that in order to kind of set the table for this, we've got to go back to, say, 1960. In 1960, there were differences between Republicans and Democrats in the United States. And that was when, by the way, John F. Kennedy ran against Richard Nixon. And yet, basically, the differences were over, tariffs, marginal tax rates, and some important national defense issues in the middle of the Cold War. But there was no disagreement over the most fundamental questions of society. There was enormous bipartisan unity. No, there's no abortion on the ballot. There's no same-sex marriage on the ballot, not even envisionable. You fast forward to the year 1980, and American politics has profoundly changed. Now, when you say Democrat and Republican, you're talking about two increasingly different worldviews. Fast forward 40 years from there to the 2020 election. And the big problem is that the only real debate is within the two parties. It's what will a Republican, proposal look like, and what will a Democratic proposal look like. So to answer your question most directly, the big problem is not just that it was Joe Biden who is and was the standard bearer for the Democratic Party. It's that the Democratic Party was moving steadily left, and even Joe Biden was moving steadily left, and has, even since his nomination and his election, moved steadily left. The left wing of the Democratic Party is obviously setting the table here. And many of us have tremendous concerns about that, because we can see exactly where this is going, because it's not hidden. They're telling us right up front.
The two worldviews that you talk about are very profound. They're extant really in every Western country now, Dr. Mohler. One is essentially derived from, I suppose you'd say, the Judeo-Christian worldview, including in terms of government, as people are now starting to talk about, the Exodus model of covenantal governance, of cooperation, of subsidiarity, do what you can for yourself, don't pass it up to the next level if you can avoid it. And the new worldview, which is so, as you say, so radically different, that it seems to me to focus on the idea that we can each be our own God, which is really the oldest worldview of all, I suppose you'd say. But it's now writ large, it's celebrated, and all it does is lead to deep division, perhaps most simply because if anybody else dares to suggest, oh no, I'm God over my life, and I say I'm God over my life, you immediately have a clash. And so you see this disintegration, this loss of unity that's reflected in those vastly different platforms that you're talking about from 1960 through to today.
Yeah, I find the economist Thomas Sowell enormously helpful here. He wrote a book just a generation ago entitled The Conflict of Visions. And so Thomas Sowell's not a Christian believer. So he's not writing out of a Christian worldview, but he's writing out of a very deeply perceptive analysis of what's happened in the society. And he said, look, we have a clash of two worldviews. And the way he put it was, it's a clash between a worldview which is constrained and a worldview which is unconstrained. And clearly he was talking about conservatives or the right when he said constrained by law, constrained by tradition, constrained by constitution, constrained by sentences, and morality versus the unconstrained, just unbridled, continual social revolution, personal autonomy. But, one of the things I think about when I go back to Thomas Sowell's Conflict of Visions is I don't think even he imagined that we were going to reach the time when on the left, they claimed a freedom from the constraint of biology. But that's where we are. And it's just a reminder, as you say it, that the most foundational issue here is basically an idolatry of the human self and of human autonomy. Because once you go down that road, if it's unconstrained, well, guess what? It's unconstrained. And anyone can show up as anything, anytime. And that's one of the reasons why the left is in such disarray. We got all kinds of issues on the right as well. But in the left, if you're unconstrained, it's very hard to have any kind of unified approach, which is why I think we see the transgender movement now very much in conflict with, ideological feminism and even gay and lesbian agendas. And, as someone who's a conservative believing in the constraint of moral law, the constraint of Christianity, the constraint even of embodiment, it's an amazing thing to watch because there is no apparent limit to this.
Another way of looking at this might be to pose the question, how do we understand liberty versus license? Liberty within constraints, within the guidelines, license, no guidelines, ultimately destroying liberty. Liberty can become, or license can become, freedom can become the enemy of freedom.
Yes, liberty is possible only under certain conditions. And I think this is something very much a part of the American genius, if I may say, but it was inherited from the British political tradition. And that is, so someone like Edmund Burke, it's a very clear understanding that order precedes liberty. And any true liberty requires a requisite prior order in such a way that you can walk out on the street. You can then claim a liberty of assembly, but that's only because, frankly, you can show up and leave your house without being afraid of being hurt or killed. And so I think what you have on the left is a denial of the fact that there's any particular order necessary for liberty. And what you have then is the disorder you refer to as license, which is exactly right. If all the rules are off, then all the rules are off. Liberty was never about all the rules being off. Liberty was about commonly accepting rules by which the society will rightly be ordered.
Now, sitting here as an Australian, considering that the upcoming election in America is probably more important to my country than who occupies the prime ministership of my own country. And I'm a very patriotic Australian, but I think that's the truth. For the last 30, 40 years, we've really been used to the idea of a unipolar global order. America striding like a colossus over global affairs, maintaining law and order, playing, if you like, the world's policeman. There are really two issues that immediately flow from that as we realize the arc of autocracy that now confronts us as becoming increasingly powerful, increasingly unified, and increasingly dangerous. And one is the question of American capacity to do anything about it. The other is the capacity of will. And in many ways, as I look at the Middle East now, it strikes me that Mr. Biden may very well be the last Democrat who has any great sympathy for Israel. Can you give us a view on American will, American capacity to be the world's policeman going forward?
Yeah, I think I can at least give a vision of how I see it. And that is that I think the question of will is less significant than many people around the world fear. I think the question of capacity is actually the more threatening question. And that's because the world's more threatening in too many places at once. And also because the rules are changed. So, for instance, right now, the United States has massive multi-billion-dollar naval vessels, either in the Red Sea or near the Red Sea. But, the fact that the Houthi rebels now have some of the weapons they have, including drones, there's a question as to, it's not just who has the naval force, but does it mean what it meant even a year ago? And there are limitations. I mean, you've got the threat of China, as you said, the arc of autocracy. I like that very much. You've got, Russia, a resurgent, and increasingly, I think more threatening China. And then you have, many other points in between. That's an awful lot for us to handle. And then, a lot of foreign policy experts are actually convinced that the greater threat is not a global power because global powers by definition actually do have some interest in maintaining global order, but it's a mid-range power. And I think we could think of some, whether we name them or not, where all kinds of things could happen. On the side of will, here's something I try to tell people. Democrats are not as they're not as democratic in terms of ideology when they show up in the White House and foreign policy, and nor are Republicans. And so I think there's a very clear Venn diagram in which there's more unity when it comes to foreign policy between Republicans and Democrats than there is on virtually any other area of life. And that is because I go back to constraint, to borrow from Thomas Sowell. We are constrained by world realities in which over time, it's not just who might be our friends, but who have been our friends for generations. Who might be our enemies, but then again, who have been our enemies as challenger civilizations for a matter of generations now. And for that reason, I think there will be far more continuity, regardless of who's elected. I think there'll be far more continuity. But you point to a potential discontinuity. So I'm not really worried about NATO. I'll just tell you that. I'm not really worried about the Pacific constitutional alliances. I am concerned about Israel, greatly and gravely concerned. And it's because of ideology, not only in the Democratic Party, but frankly in the academic elites of the West, and in the I'll just say the cultural elites of the West. So deep anti-Semitism, which is now very openly demonstrated into opposition to Israel. There is a constraint upon how much the United States can change this policy, and that is that our entire posture in the Middle East comes down to the fact that we have one dependable ally, which is the one constitutional, democratic government there in the Middle East, which is Israel. And the commitments are so deep. I at least would like to think that it's going to be very difficult to undo that. But on the Democratic Party side, it's going to be very interesting. It's not just would a Democrat hold to a contrary position. I think the answer is yes. Would such a Democrat be elected president? I think that's still an open question. I hope the answer is no. But I just want to come back to the fact that I think that the relationship with Israel is not just a political relationship. It's not a recent relationship. American foreign policy is, for generations now, staked on that relationship with Israel. And by the way, it's not just the United States. It's also many of those Arab states which have not come out in real open opposition to Israel. They've made criticisms, but quite frankly, their own foreign policy depends upon the existence of Israel as a check, for instance, on Iran, if nothing else.
Just on that, before we come back to the presidentials, it strikes me as extraordinary that so many, often quite well-meaning people in your country and mine and in Britain and so forth, don't seem to recognize the very simple point that if you're worried about the deaths of Palestinians, it's Hamas you call upon to come out from hiding behind women and children held at gunpoint. They are the people who started this, and they are the people we should be calling upon to stop it. Yet all of the focus is on Israel. What does that say about, I can't put this any other way, our loss of an intelligent understanding of what's really happening, and perhaps with it a loss of moral compass as well?
I can't imagine a better way to put it. A loss of intelligence and a loss of conscience, or a denial and suppression of conscience, as the Apostle Paul would say. When you think about Israel and the Palestinians, I mean, these are ongoing problems. They have been. Even the UN resolution that created the state of Israel in 1948, foresaw a different situation than what we have now, but clearly established Israel as a Jewish state with overwhelming international support and recognition. I think part of what we're seeing right now is that there has been movement on the left, first in Europe, by the way, but now in the United States, where there is this attempted and I think very synthetic supposed commonality between liberation movements, and identity politics very much a part of this. And so you have these leftist groups, and they have seized upon the Palestinian claim, saying in the aftermath of colonialism, that's exactly the same claim as for Indian independence, or that's exactly the same claim as for democracy in Southeast Asia. And of course, it's not exactly the same claim. And you're exactly right. By the way, the greatest enemy of the health of the Palestinian people is exactly Hamas, just as you say. It's Hamas that has used Palestinians as a human shield, embedded themselves so that there would have to be massive destruction in order to get at their military power. But it's also interesting, if you're just looking at it honestly, the Palestinians have been politically marginalized by the Arab nations. No one wants to talk about that out loud, but I mean, Egypt has closed its border with Gaza because Egypt does not want incursions of Palestinians into Egypt. So the idea of Arab or Islamic solidarity here is not all that real. But where it's real is on the American college campus, and where it's real is on the political left. And I was just writing a piece in recent days where you go back and even in the 1960s and the 1970s, there are conversation between radicals on the left in certain movements in the U.S. and in Europe with the Palestinian cause. And so there seeds were planted of this a long time ago.
Well, to move on then for a moment, we could spend all day talking about this. It's deeply troubling to me, and I cannot help but think that you could not hold the views that the colonial oppressor line against Israel if you had any understanding of history and of the Holocaust and of the reality. I test your feeling on this, that actually all of us all right, the West liberated those Jews who'd not been yet destroyed in the gas chambers in 1945. That is true. But it is also the case that most of us were very slow to help, to recognise in the 1930s what was happening and do something about it. Your country and mine, I think, included. We all bear some culpability for what's happened to the Jewish people, and yet now we rush to condemn them as being engaged in genocide when the very term was invented to try and describe what the Nazis were trying to do. It is mind-boggling inversion of reality.
But you're exactly right. But that's what the left does. And I don't just mean to do name calling here and just disparage the left, but this is why the left is the left. It's because it only has one template for anything. And that is a liberation that it defines and makes as its moral cause. And so in this case, it's to liberate the Palestinians. It ignores everything else. And this is why, all the identity politics just means that, they focus on one thing. And they make it their monomaniacal, focus, and they deny the importance of anything else. And so they deny the history of Israel, and they don't want to acknowledge it. And by the way, they don't want to acknowledge the history of Palestinians either. They don't want to acknowledge that the two-state solution was proposed by the United Nations in 1948. It was the Palestinians that rejected it. It was not Israel accepted that definition in 1948. It was the Palestinians that rejected it. It was the Arab nations that declared war for the annihilation of Israel. And so, I appreciate the fact that you insist on some historical context here and intellectual honesty. And I think we have to keep coming back to these things. The first to reject the two-state solution was the Palestinians and the Arab nations in 1948. And by the way, the most vehement rejection of a so-called two-state solution right now doesn't come from Israel. It comes from Hamas.
Yeah, easily forgotten. Well, in the context of all of this, it looks like we're going to have a rerun, well, almost inevitable now, I suppose, of Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump at the end of this year. So that raises all sorts of questions. Can I begin by asking, in your view, what should Americans be thinking about deeply when they cast their vote? Because it can't be. Well, I know quite a few Americans, and they say to me, "I'm on the horns of a real dilemma here. Some of them say, I don't want to vote at all, which never seems responsible to me. But then I come from a country where the vote's compulsory and where I think every citizen should vote. But what advice would you give to your fellow Americans as they try and weigh through this very difficult conundrum? Forgive me for saying that, but it looks like a very difficult conundrum to me.
Yes, and I want to be really clear. I find both men morally undeserving of the office. I'll just say that. I think both of them are morally undeserving of the office, but one of them is going to be president. And so I want, as a Christian, to be absolutely honest in intellectual and moral terms. I would not personally choose either of these men to be president. Joe Biden, over his political career, just absolute political mayhem. And by the way, just servile obedience to whatever is necessary to get him elected to office. What he did on abortion in 2020, and basically switching his position overnight, one night, so that he didn't lose the primary the next day. And I'll go so far as to say, I think he sold his soul to the culture of death, and just a politically corrupt figure in and of himself. Needless to say, in my lifetime, he had to withdraw from one presidential campaign from not only stealing someone else's speech, but stealing it badly. And then you have Donald Trump. And I mean, it just is a moral problem. He's a complexity of moral problems, not to mention, just absolute ego. And so from a Christian perspective, I don't want either of these two men, but one of them, unless there's something unforeseen, is going to be elected president of the United States. And it's like Groundhog Day, famous movie here in the United States. We're back here once again. And so what I would say to Christians is we're electing a government, not in the same sense it's true of a parliamentary system like in Australia, or in Britain, but very close to it these days. We are actually electing a government. And so I am encouraging Christians to elect a government we think will uphold what is right and good and true, the dignity and sanctity of human life, righteousness, all the virtues that we should look for, limited virtues, by the way, we should look for from government and policies. And so, for me, the issue is very clear. I'll just tell you, and I think for most Christians they are. So let me just give you some math here for a moment. From 1980 until 2020, the evangelical vote went Republican versus Democrat, almost exactly the same, marginal changes in all those election cycles from 1980 to 2020. Evangelical Christians, conservative Roman Catholics, overwhelmingly have voted for the Republican candidate because of the policies. And I think that's not going to change in 2024. So I'll just tell you, I would tell people, look, let's be honest about the two candidates. And by the way, we now know a massive structural flaw in our system. And that is that I'm a citizen of the state of Kentucky as well as the United States of America. Our primary doesn't come for another 2 months. And it's over now. So when someone says, well, the Republican Party chose Donald Trump, well, sort of, but not really. That's just, we have some structural problems here. And the Democratic Party, as you well know, they're Democratic figures, and even especially, I guess, Democratic figures on the left who are scared to death because of Joe Biden's age. I don't think anyone would say that and by the way, something like 70% of Democrats polled said they thought he was too old to be president, but he's going to be the Democratic nominee. So I may have digressed a bit, and I apologize for that, but we clearly have a structural problem. And to be honest, I'm not sure there's any way to fix it. But if we have these two candidates this early in what was supposed to be a primary season, something's broken.
Well, certainly looking from the outside, and as somebody who wishes America well, and for Australia's sake and for the free world's sake, this is a very important issue. And it's quite different to contemplate the differences, because in Australia we don't elect a prime minister, we elect a party, although it's become presidential, and that party decides who is the most appropriate person to lead. That's the British model. Although our Senate's exactly modelled on yours, precisely.
But you do, by the time you vote, you know who at least is the party leader.
Yeah, absolutely, you do. And if it works properly, then you trust that party to say, well, if necessary, we'll change the leader. But people don't like that very much either, because they feel they've cast their vote, understandably. Nothing's ever perfect, including government. But would it be fair to surmise, as I listen to you, what you're really saying is that you would be a person who would say, as I would say, I don't think this is rocket science, that character in leaders matters. You've got a situation where there are very big question marks here on both candidates. So you have to consider policy and likely approaches to government. And that becomes the only option left, because a lot of people cast a lot of judgments. How could you possibly vote for a nihilist? Or how could you possibly vote for somebody whose son behaves the way the current president does? I'm just, sort of trying to reflect what people say. You're actually saying, well, in the end, you're left with no choice but to try and analyse who might implement policies that are best for the American society.
Yeah, let me be honest. I think it would be really stressful for American evangelical Christians if we had, say, a Republican candidate with the right policies, but an abysmal character, versus a Democratic nominee with the wrong policies, but a sterling character. But that is not our situation. And so it's exactly as you summarized there, and as I tried to argue earlier, I think the character issues largely cancel themselves out. I think with these two, we're dealing with two men who I think neither of which belongs in the Oval Office, but one of them will be. So I have to think, well, who will be the Secretary of Defense in such an administration? What will be the legislative, priority in such an administration? What will be their reach and administration of the administrative state, which in the United States is increasingly threatening? What will they do in terms of executive orders? Who's going to be in the room when these big decisions are made? I think those are the cogent questions, and that again, I don't think there's any mystery here. So let me just say, if I could speak to Australians and to Christians elsewhere, I would say, look, the only question is how many Republicans turn out to vote, how many Democrats turn out to vote, and then what happens with some marginal third-party candidates? Because otherwise, this election is already basically over. It's just a question of a few swing districts and what might be described as some swing states. But even then, it comes down to some very small mathematical issues. This isn't going to be, unless something happens, this isn't going to be a 60-40 election. I don't think it's going to be a 55-45 election. Joe Biden won some states, by 10 and 12,000 votes out of hundreds of thousands cast. And I think it's going to be that way in 2024. So it's going to be a matter, again, of that particular day and in that particular vote, who shows up and who doesn't.
That's an interesting question. As I touched on earlier, I live in a country where the vote has been compulsory since the 1920s, and you don't. And I hear people say, I couldn't vote for either, so I won't vote, which seems to me actually in the end to be a wrong call. I think we have a responsibility one way or another, even if it is simply voting for the lesser of two troublesome candidates.
Yes, I am Burkean, I would say, in many ways, going back to Edmund Burke, key figure in the conservative frame of mind and in the British Parliament. And so, the question of the vote was very much a part of the British Parliament's discussion at the time in the 18th and, of course, in the 19th century, who should be, to the franchise should be extended, how far, et cetera. And I like some of those British parliamentary debates. I'm an Anglophile, and it shows. Because I think the big question is, do you want people who have no idea what they're doing voting, or do you want a system in which those who are most politically interested vote? And I'll say, I think I'm in the second category. So I'll just argue with you here for a moment. I think I want those who are most politically interested to vote. I want to get more people interested, but I don't want people voting who have no idea what they're doing. And so I like the old, British, Tory policy, the Conservative Party policy, which is want the people who have a stake voting.
Yeah, I do genuinely understand those arguments. For me, it's a very, very narrow call. It's just that I think that sometimes people ought to be obliged in some way to pay some attention and to be involved. But I understand the very powerful arguments that you're making. Yeah. I certainly understand what you're saying. By the way, as a little segue, I read the other day that the most famous quote attributed to Edmund Burke, the father of conservatism and so forth, who, I'm told, on his deathbed, he spent his last 3 days reading William Wilberforce's Real Christianity. Interesting little segue into another question you may or may not care to comment. I read somewhere that, in fact, his most famous saying is, all it takes is for evil to prosper is good men to remain silent, or words to that effect. Apparently, he didn't say it. Are you aware of whether he did or did not?
I'm aware of the debate. Of all the things that Burke may or may not have said, that isn't the most important anyway. But
No.
it is interesting that these quotations take on a life of their own. One of the problems, I think, especially as you go back to the 18th century and the 19th century, is a lot of people said a lot of things they heard someone else say. And so who said it first is a huge question. And so, as you know, the ideas of intellectual property are quite different now than they were in the 18th century. And so I'm a little reluctant to say, if there's a text, for instance, I think Shakespeare is often quoted, but Shakespeare's using something he's heard. And so I really don't know. But, the Burkean statement about all that's needed for the triumph of evil is for, good men to do nothing. There's a lot of truth in that. I'm not sure if Burke said it or not. I think the most important things Burke talked about is the necessity of, as I said, order for liberty, and the danger and temptation of a tyrannical government, and the key distinction, I would say, between a revolution and a reformation.
Well, I agree entirely, but he also went to the heart of political courage when, he insisted that it was not his responsibility to do what his electors wanted so much as to what he really owed them was his mind and his conscience, and the willingness to make an informed and true and courageous decision on an issue, whatever it happened to be.
Yeah, and he lost his seat.
To come back to what's happening in America, you get the impression that America's institutions are being politicized and weaponized. Colorado's attempt to strike Trump from the ballot, for example, but it seems to be almost endless. And from this side of the Pacific, you get the strong impression that a lot of Americans, particularly those who, put it this way, have been supporting Trump because they feel shut out of the system. That's the argument that Donald Trump is the product of the division and the marginalization and the breakdown of trust, rather than the cause of it. All these, what look to be politically motivated campaigns, weaponization of institutions and the law and what have you, all they do is to exacerbate the problem whereby America splits. President Trump's you continue to use the term, President Trump is an innocent victim of a witch hunt, and therefore will lock our support in even more because those elites are continuing to refuse to listen to us. Is there any truth in that view, do you think?
Well, I kind of hear you talking about the view that it's true and the view that the fact that people hold that view are animated by it. I think there's truth in both of those, actually. Look, the populist revolt that has happened in so many Western nations, and it didn't really start here. You might say, if you look back to some of the characters in the American political scene in the 1960s and 70s, but Ronald Reagan was not a populist. He was a conservative. He had massive popular support, but he wasn't a populist in that sense. But you certainly seen the rise of this elsewhere in Europe, and now very much so in the United States. It's kind of a pan-Western phenomenon. I think they're very legitimate grievances. I think that that's part of the problem right now is that the elites are reaping what they have sown, and frankly, the words that are hurting them are the words they said themselves. So, I mean, you remember Hillary Clinton speaking of conservatives as the deplorables? I mean, this is the condescension of the liberal elites is massive. You also have, quite frankly, a lot of the blue states in the United States, and those are the more liberal states that vote Democratic. They consider the red states to be flyover country. And so I live in the state of Kentucky, and when I'm on the coast in major metropolitan areas, frankly, they don't want Kentucky to have anything to say with the future of this country. That's why the liberals are very frustrated with the United States Senate, because Wyoming has two senators and California has two senators. And, so Wyoming actually has a constraint on California. Well, they don't like that, even though that's an essential part of the American constitutional order. So this populism, look, a lot of it's unformed, and how it can be manipulated. And in the age of digital technologies and social media, it can be manipulated very fast. But I want to say a lot of those resentments are actually quite accurate in terms of their diagnosis. One of the problems with populism is its resentments are often valid, but it lacks serious proposals to fix the problem they complain about. And so that's where you actually have to have someone show up with policy.
If I can come back to something that a couple of Australian observers that I respect have said, it goes to the whole attitude by Trump that he was robbed of an election, and they contrast it often with Al Gore's graciousness when it came down to the wire with George Bush back in the early 2000s. And the view that a very senior person I respect in this country said, it finished me when Donald Trump wouldn't accept the vote as a peaceful means of transferring power. And the outrage over that does justify some of the attacks on him. That willingness to be gracious in accepting the transfer of power at the point of a pencil seems to me to be critically important to a country moving forward and accepting that many of its fellows have different views. Many of your fellow country people have different views. But that's breaking down, isn't it? That's the point you just made, that modern elites just can't believe that those who disagree with them should have a say.
Right. Well, let me go back to the election in 2020 for just a moment. President Trump's absolutely responsible for his violations of constitutional decorum and quite frankly, I think personal honor in much of that and in the events of January the 6th. But if you were on the Trump team in 2020, even before Election Day, you're going to be very aware that there have been shenanigans going on in places like Pennsylvania, where the court just redefined the voting mechanism, taking it completely out of the legislative context and doing so claiming the mandate of COVID-19. You see similar things happening elsewhere. And so, this has been a big problem in the United States. And part of the populist complaint is people aren't counting the votes rightly. Now, I am going to state for the record that I believe that Donald Trump lost the election. He clearly lost the popular vote, and I think he lost the marginal vote necessary for an electoral college win in states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, et cetera. And because of that, he should have conceded the election. But that's not Donald Trump, and that's not what we've got. And right now we have a situation in which there's so many people on the left in the Democratic Party who are saying that's such an egregious break of a democratic norm. And yes, it is. You compare it with Al Gore in 2000. Yes, it is. But there are many Democratic members of Congress who would not affirm the election of George W. Bush. They would not affirm it. You have one of the losing Democratic senatorial candidates in the state of California on the left who claimed that the election was rigged. So this kind of language isn't just found out. Again, I'm not trying to relieve former President Trump of any responsibility, but I'm saying, look, this is a deep democratic crisis. We're going to have to get this fixed. A part of the issue here is that our constitutional federal system makes very clear that it is the states that hold elections, not the federal government. And so state by state, this presents some fairly daunting challenges.
Your view on the state of American evangelicalism. So, for example, I understand I haven't seen it, but a new documentary film, I think titled God and Country, is creating quite a stir. It explores what it considers to be the use of political idolatry within American evangelicalism, and it targets in particular the so-called Christian nationalist movement, frames it as being unfaithful to true Christian belief and principles. So any general remarks? I'd just be interested in your view on where you have a fan, in one sense, the former very distinguished Australian ambassador to Washington, Kim Beazley, said to me, Australians misunderstand America, and one of the major misunderstandings is that, he put it at around 70 million committed evangelicals. He said, we miss the strength of commitment to community, to one another. He says in Australia, we deride them as narrow-minded or as fundamentalist, but in reality, of course, in that number of people, you have many, many outstanding citizens and a lot of very thoughtful people. But there do seem to be divisions, and there's this problem of political alignment with one side that you've already touched on. I'd just be interested in your general views on the state of Christian belief in America, and particularly young people. I know that's a broad topic, but I'd just be interested in an overview from you.
Yeah, I think American evangelicalism, so in other words, if I were a Catholic and you asked me about American Catholicism, I would say, well, that's a very complex question because it all matters where you are, what generation you are, et cetera. It's the same thing among American evangelicals. So look, there is always a problem on defining evangelicalism against the right and the left. That's always a problem. It was a problem in the 50s and 60s when the modern evangelical movement, became identified with that word. It's a problem now. But what we also have is that in the larger culture, the great hatred is toward American evangelicals because we're the great resistance force against progressivism and the left here in the United States, and that's just a matter of fact. It's largely evangelical Christians in these largely red states who simply won't go along with the program. And by the way, yeah, they're quite condescending towards evangelicals in the United States, but we're the people having the babies and raising the children. And so in other words, and by the way, look at those red states and the people growing the food and so many other things. I'm not saying there aren't any liberal parents and there aren't any liberal farmers. I'm just saying that where you find parents and farmers, you find an overrepresentation of people like evangelical Christians. I'm also old enough, and you can tell by looking at me, that I've been around for a while. And so I can tell you that the liberal left has tried to marginalize conservative Christians in the United States by calling us the new right, the radical right, the new radical right, the Christian right, the new Christian right. And now it's Christian nationalism. Now, I want to tell you, there have always been some Christians who kind of mix a true nationalism in a negative sense, an ideological sense, with their Christian theology, kind of in a Christian identity politics and one thing. That's not what I think is healthy. But there are people who call me a Christian nationalist because I believe in the importance of the nation. And I also believe that that this nation is Christian in its historical context, to the extent that even the more secular founders were secular only in the context that they sought some distance from Christianity, but they assumed the Christian worldview. They assumed a Christian metaphysic. They assumed a Christian morality, as a matter of fact. And someone like Alexis de Tocqueville will come along and make very clear as a European observer, this is basically what it looks like when Protestant Christianity becomes a government. And I want to make very clear that, as our Declaration of Independence does, that we're endowed by our Creator with certain rights. So all that to say, there is a problem of just a naive patriotism. There's always a problem of a cultural Christianity that turns into some kind of civil religion. It's always a problem. But on the left, the problem is that there are conservative Christians who actually believe that's supposed to make a difference in our vote and in our civic engagement. And by the way, the media product you mentioned, it's part of a large constellation of things going on. And like the most famous of them is being underwritten by Rob Reiner, who's been one of the most liberal secular proponents of the Democratic Party in the United States. And he's found some evangelical fellow travelers to help make his point. And all I'm saying is there will be, by the way, and I say this, I'm not a prophet or a son of a prophet, but I'm going to get out on a limb here. I think a lot of these people will cease calling themselves evangelical in fairly short order, because evangelical Christians are sticky people. And if you're looking for the cultural elites, don't look here. By and large, American evangelical Christians, even though the vast majority are what you would define as middle class, we're not the cultural elite. We are not the people being handed statues in Hollywood. We are not the people who have just been given tenure at Yale. That world's gone. But we are the people who are raising the kids and nurturing the families and tilling the ground. And, they can't do without us.
So to try and explore this a bit more, you're plainly saying, I think, that there is a right understanding of nationalism. There is a nationalism that is good, based around, I suppose, patriotism, love of your neighbour, a desire to conduct a society in a broken world that's coherent and delivers law and order and what have you. The contrast, it seems to me, and it's playing out writ large as I understand it in America at the moment, is that nationalism's so evil we shouldn't even have national borders, which ultimately, of course, will destroy nationalism. There'll be no nation of America in a recognisable form if you continue to allow those sorts of numbers coming in unchecked. Who knows who's amongst them? Who knows what their objectives are? So the right understanding of nationalism is not an evil or a selfish doctrine. It doesn't play to the idea that we should open our borders on the basis that that's a Christian and compassionate thing to do, it seems to me.
Yeah. Well, and there's a deep-seated understanding of this. And you said it rightly. We want a proper patriotism, but a patriotism means that there's some shared understanding of mutuality, mutual commitment, mutual defense, mutual contribution to the building up of a society. To some extent, that requires at least an overwhelming common language. It doesn't mean we don't welcome people, don't speak the language, but it does mean that, without apology, most of the conversation in the United States about these policy issues is going to end up being in English for very good historic reasons. We have borders. This nation has borders. It's fought over those borders. It fought a civil war over those borders and a common national project. The United States did not come easily to a national identity, but it is a very necessary national identity. And so, last night I was looking at an historical question related to the relationship between Germany and France. And you know what? There's been a territory, as you well know, brutally contested between, take the city of Strasbourg, for example. Is it a German city? Is it a French city? Well, depends on when you look at the map. But you know what? As much as there's some contested territory, everybody knows what Germany is, and everybody knows what France is. And I think that's true of the United States of America. I think, and you mentioned open borders, which just means the elimination of nations. I think the left sees nations as far too limiting in their unconstrained vision. And so they really do have a globalist agenda. I don't think that would really matter, to be honest, if it were not for the fact that an awful lot of big business, international business, as in the Davos crowd, they've come to the same conclusion. They want the entire world as a market, so borders are barriers to that. And frankly, they want the entire world a potential employee base and or consumer base. And so I think this is a huge issue in the United States. In the last couple of days where we're having this conversation, a very significant number of Democrats voted with the vast majority, if not all Republicans in the United States House, to condemn President Biden's mismanagement of the border. That tells you the political reality. The Democratic Party doesn't have a hope of winning the White House or control of either of the houses of Congress if it doesn't get on the right side of the American people on this issue. I don't know how it gets there, by the way, but that's just a political fact. The vast majority of Americans are really convinced that the nation's borders do matter. And by the way, the most interesting thing is that this includes fairly recent immigrants to the United States. This is the perplexity. Look at a state like Texas, where maybe even especially in some areas, voters in the border counties, which include a vast number of recent immigrants, they're saying you got to get control of the border. That should tell us something.
Another area where progressive elites don't seem to believe in the sort of Western democracy's value of each individual, it seems to me, is highlighted by what Joel Kotkin in California calls the new feudalism. So if you take Silicon Valley, and it's extraordinary, isn't it, that really they are what you might describe as the real left today. They're the real progressives. They are, by and large, wealthier in absolute and relative terms than any human beings have ever been on the planet. But they belong in a state where they're a group of people who are very powerful. They're massively ideologically driven, not all of them, but many of them appear to be. They're deeply invested in what might be called the new energy forms, deeply invested in every way.
If dishonestly, but yes.
Well, and what they're really driving, and this is what Joel Kotkin's pointing to, their disdain for ordinary people says, oh, well, the environment matters more than anything else, so we'll push out manufacturing. The middle class goes with it, and California's middle class is being hollowed out unbelievably rapidly. And 80%, I think I'm right in saying this, of the emerging jobs, the new jobs, are low paid, which in America are very low paid. And so you really have an unbelievably privileged aristocracy at the top, very few in the middle, and a vast grouping of people who are living extremely modestly in a way that means that there's just such a gulf between the experience of the wealthiest and most privileged Californians and everybody else. And that opportunity for middle Americans to really prosper and enjoy their lives is apparently not taken into account. Surely that's a cause of enormous dislocation, of disaffection, of division.
Yes. I was just in Silicon Valley days ago, and in the culture and talking with leaders and also preaching and teaching in churches. It is an incredible place where you see exactly what you described. The most practical result of that is the fact that Texas is growing so fast with transplanted Californians and other states as well. Idaho, just right up to the north. You see this exodus of the middle class. If you add to what you described, artificial intelligence, you talk about the pushing out of the middle class, the pushing out of middle class values, the pushing out of middle class votes, the pushing out of middle class just families, and jobs, by the way. This idea of artificial intelligence, the way they actually want to deploy it, will be the death of the middle class, period. It'll just be the absolute death of the middle class, certainly as a class that would live in a place like Silicon Valley and would have jobs. There aren't going to be jobs in factories. There aren't going to be any accountants. There aren't going to be any, small store owners. Everything's going to be in this great digital world. They really believe that, as much as they're also committed, as you would know, many of them, to the denial of the constraint of what it means to be human. I mean, there are people who are deeply invested into billions of dollars in transhumanist experiments out there. So, I'll tell you, I get depressed thinking about what you just described. And so I do think the American people aren't going to put up with this happening voluntarily. But this is where the Silicon Valley types, they see themselves as overlords. And they're not very shy about it either. And I don't think it'll be just the United States. I think Australia, Europe, you just go down the list. It's all a part of their agenda.
Well, like you, I see it as very challenging, and it can be very depressing indeed. And that immediately raises then for you and me the notion of a secure hope. Where do we find joy and purpose and meaning that transcends all of this? I'd just be interested now, as we, if you like, land the plane. I think you've just written another book on or your latest book on the parables of Jesus Christ. So what is it about our day and age that makes you think these are still relevant, perhaps more relevant than ever? Because it's not just that the world you've mentioned, it's all a bit depressing. The reality is that this modern world is hardly producing a happy citizenry. We've never seen levels of misery and unhappiness and mental illness as the sort we have now. So why are those parables, which you love and which I love, so important for today?
Well, because first of all, they were told by Jesus, the Savior of the world, the divine Logos, the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, very God of very God. The Lord of creation and the Lord of the cosmos. And he told these stories. And as you know, he told these stories so that they sneak up on us. And that's why the parables are so unique, even in the four gospels, and in particular in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but also in John. It's these parables that sneak up on us. And, Jesus said to his disciples, I speak to them in parables because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. The parables break through in ways that sometimes just another form of, say, explanation wouldn't. The parable of the sower and the soils, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the widow and her coins, the prodigal son. I mean, all these things just loom so large. I will tell you, my dear friend, that I write books on the exposition of Scripture because I do the exposition of Scripture, and I don't want to write books merely on the big worldview and cultural issues. I think for my own spiritual health. So I've got another big book on those issues coming out, and I'm working on right now. But I've got a book on a theology of incarnation and a book on the three offices of Christ that will come out even sooner. And so I'm just trying to say I need that for my own spiritual health, because if all I deal with is the cultural reality, as much as I think I have to deal with it and try to understand it in Christian terms, I get my deepest health in my walk with Christ by teaching and preaching the Word of God. And so I appreciate you raising the book on the parables. I need the parables. That's why I need to hear Jesus speak to me, and I want to help Christians to exult in that.
And you wouldn't be exclusive about that. Your message is that is where secure hope for each of us lies. That's where joy is to be found. One last one, just to bring it home, if I may. Your favorite parable and why?
Oh, what a great question. I think if I had only one parable, it would be one cycle. It'd be the parables of lostness and foundness, with Jesus in Luke 15, ending with the parable of the prodigal son, which, by the way, most Christians don't finish.
Yeah. It's two sons.
Yes, it's two lost sons. Yes, it's two lost sons. One of them found, and the other an open question. But with the ominous understanding he may have walked away from his father and his brother. But starting out with the lost sheep, and then the lost coins, and then the lost son. I wouldn't even say, if I weren't a Christian, that may be the most concise display of literary genius in all of human history. But I think it's much more than that. The Son of God spoke this. This is the very word of God. And I know so many people have come to Christ by understanding what it meant to be a prodigal and to be welcomed home by the Father.
And hopefully some of them chilled by the reality that thinking that they're right with their father when they're not, the older one, that's a warning. Well, you're a far greater mind and certainly theologian than I am, but at that point we meet, because they're my favorite as well. That little set, they're so beautiful. Yes. They're so powerful. They're libraries worth of wisdom in a few short sentences. And I've often thought to myself, frankly, no mere human being, no matter what level of genius he or she had as a writer, could have packed as much wisdom into a few short statements in that way.
No. And the fact that all you have to say is the prodigal son, and you know what the story is. And amazingly, even secular people, they may not understand the meaning of the story or the context of the story, but they understand what you're talking about. Jesus told compelling stories, and we're talking about them in shorthand 2 millennia later. That's remarkable.
Dr. Mohler, thank you very much. You've been very generous with your time, and I appreciate it, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers will as well.
Sir John, I'm very thankful for you, and to your listeners, I would give a word of encouragement. And for believers, I would say, as you think about the things we've been talking about in the American election, pray for us, and we'll pray for you.
All the best.